The assessment: the Galactic Concord had ruled the stars for 12,000 years. And in all that time, they had never been wrong about a species. They had conquered the Crethians, whose armored bodies could survive the vacuum of space, and they had absorbed the Mindweavers, whose telepathic powers could crush a mind from across a planet. And they had even brought the silicon-based Lithori into their fold. Beings who lived for 10,000 years and thought in patterns. No organic mind could follow 847 species served to Concord now. Each one cataloged and classified and assigned its proper place in the great hierarchy of civilizations. So when the long-range sensors detected radio signals coming from an unremarkable yellow star in the Orion Arm, the Concord did what it always did. They sent an evaluation vessel to assess the new species and determine its worth. The ship was called the Eternal Judgment, and it was crewed by the Volanti, a species bred specifically for the task of assessment. And their captain, a being named Keth Voran, had evaluated over 200 species in his career, and not once had his recommendations been questioned. The Eternal Judgment arrived in the solar system and took up a hidden position behind the fourth planet, a red dusty world the natives called Mars. And from there, the Volanti watched. They watched for 3 of the local years. They observed the dominant species, which called itself human, and they recorded everything. And what they found did not impress them. The humans were small and soft, with no natural armor to protect their fragile bodies, and their skin could be cut by simple metals, and their bones could be broken by modest impacts. And they required a very specific mixture of gases to breathe, and they could only survive in a narrow range of temperatures. They had no venom and no claws worth mentioning, and they could not regenerate lost limbs, and they could not see in the dark or hear frequencies beyond a limited range. And their reflexes were slow compared to most predator species. But the most damning observation was their lifespan. Average human lived for only 80 years, which was nothing, which was barely enough time to learn the basics of existence, which meant that every generation had to start almost from scratch, relearning what their ancestors had known. How could such a species ever amount to anything? The Volanti continued their observations and found more reasons for concern. The humans had not even unified their own world, and instead they had divided their planet into hundreds of competing nations, and these nations frequently went to war with each other, and the wars were brutal and wasteful and accomplished nothing of lasting value. They killed each other with chemical propellants, launching small metal projectiles at high speeds, a technology so primitive that Keth Voran had to check his historical databases to confirm that such weapons had ever existed. Their most advanced vessels could barely reach their own moon, and they had sent only robots to explore the other planets in their system. And their understanding of faster-than-light travel was purely theoretical. They were, in every measurable way, one of the weakest species the Volanti had ever encountered. Thoniner compiled his report with a feeling of mild disappointment, because he had hoped for something interesting. But the data was clear. He transmitted his findings to Nexus Prime, the capital of the Galactic Concord, where the High Assembly would make the final determination. The assembly chamber was vast beyond human comprehension, a sphere of living crystal that floated in the upper atmosphere of a gas giant, and inside this sphere, representatives of all 847 member species gathered to conduct the business of civilization. Kevin's report was one of hundreds on the agenda that day. A minor matter, barely worth discussing. The holographic display showed images of Earth, and the assembled representatives watched with expressions ranging from boredom to mild amusement. And a few of the more predatory species licked their lips or clicked their mandibles with something like hunger. As you can see, Keth Voran explained, his translator membrane rippling with practiced condescension. The species presents no threat to Concord interests, and their resources are minimal, and their technology is primitive, and their biology is unsuited for any role requiring strength or endurance or longevity. Krethian Admiral shifted his massive armored body and spoke in a voice like grinding stones. What use are they then? Labor, Keth Voren replied, and they breed quickly and require little maintenance. And they seem capable of following simple instructions. And they could be useful in mining operations or agricultural work on worlds too marginal for more valuable species. A Mindweaver representative, a being of pure thought contained in a crystalline shell, projected a question directly into the minds of all present. What of their violence and what of their wars? And do they pose a danger to themselves or to Concord personnel? Keth Voren made a gesture of dismissal. Their violence is directed primarily at each other, and their weapons are incapable of threatening Concord technology. And a single patrol vessel could pacify their entire world in less than a day if such action became necessary. The vote was called and passed unanimously. Humanity was officially classified as a Class 7 civilization, which meant primitive, which meant weak, which meant beneath the Concord's immediate concern. They would be contacted when the Concord deemed them ready, perhaps in another 1,000 years, perhaps longer. And until then they would be left alone to develop or to destroy themselves. Whichever came first. The eternal judgment departed the solar system, and Keth Voren moved on to his next assignment. And the matter of humanity was filed away in the vast archives of the Concord, where it would likely never be reviewed again. No one in the assembly had thought to ask what the humans had been doing while they were being watched. No one considered that a species capable of detecting radio signals might also be capable of detecting a ship hiding behind their fourth planet. No one wondered what conclusions the humans might have drawn from 3 years of silent observation, and no one imagined that this small, soft, short-lived species might respond to being judged with something other than acceptance, because the Concord had been right about every species for 12,000 years, and they saw no reason to doubt themselves now on Earth. In a secure facility deep beneath a mountain range, a group of humans sat in a room filled with screens, and on those screens was every piece of data the Eternal Judgment had transmitted back to Nexus Prime. They had intercepted it all, they had decoded it all, and they had read, with growing cold fury, exactly what the galaxy thought of them. The most senior human in the room, a woman with gray hair and hard eyes, turned to her colleagues. "So," she said, "they think we are weak." No one answered, because no answer was needed. They all knew what came next. The humiliation 18 months passed before the Galactic Concord decided that humanity was ready to receive its official welcome to the FIRA. Welcome to the FIOE. Galaxy High Emissary Salvith was chosen for the task. A Volanthi diplomat of considerable experience who had brought dozens of primitive species into the fold. And she approached the assignment with the same confidence she had brought to every other mission in her long career. Her ship, the Divine Mandate, was escorted by 3 Krethian warships, each one a mountain of metal and weapons capable of cracking a planet's crust. And this escort was not strictly necessary. But Salvith believed in making a proper impression. The humans needed to understand their place in the universe from the very beginning. The fleet emerged from hyperspace near Earth's moon, and immediately the communication channels filled with human transmissions. Excited voices speaking in dozens of languages, all asking the same questions. Who are you, and why are you here, and what do you want, Salvith? Found their eagerness amusing. The landing site was a large plaza in a city called Geneva, where the humans had gathered their leaders from around the world. And Salvith descended from her shuttle with an entourage of guards and translators and ceremonial attendants. And she looked upon the crowd of small, soft creatures with what she hoped was an expression of benevolent superiority. Secretary General Marcus Chen stepped forward to greet her. A man of middle years with a calm face and careful eyes. And he extended his hand in what was apparently a human gesture of welcome. Elizabeth did not take it. "I am High Emissary Salveth of the Galactic Concord," she announced, her translator membrane converting her words into sounds the humans could understand. "And I bring greetings from the 847 species who have built civilization among the stars." Chun lowered his hand slowly, and something flickered in his eyes, but his voice remained polite. "On behalf of humanity, I welcome you to Earth." The formal ceremony continued for several hours, with speeches and presentations and carefully choreographed displays of human culture. And Salveth endured it all with patience, because she knew that what came next would erase any illusions the humans might have about their importance. The real meeting took place in a conference room in a building the humans called the United Nations. And here Salveth sat across from Chun and his delegation, which included military officers and scientists and representatives from the most powerful human nations. Admiral Yuki Tanaka sat at the far end of the table, a small woman with silver hair and a face that gave nothing away. And Salveth noted that she had not spoken once during the entire ceremony. Salveth activated a holographic display that showed the galaxy, with Concord space highlighted in blue, a vast swath of stars that encompassed most of the known universe. "Your species stands at a crossroads," she began, "and the Concord has decided to extend to you the same opportunity we have extended to countless others." She manipulated the display to show Earth, a tiny dot on the edge of Concord territory. "You will be granted membership in the Concord as a developing species, which means you will be protected from external threats and guided toward proper civilization." Chun leaned forward. "And what does this membership require of us?" Salveth had expected this question and answered without hesitation. "You're 17. Colony worlds will be administered by Concord overseers, who will ensure efficient development. And your people will contribute labor to various Concord projects, primarily mining and agricultural operations. And in exchange, you will receive access to our technology and our markets and our protection." The room was silent. "You are asking us to surrender our independence," Chun said finally. "I am offering you survival," Salveth corrected, "because the galaxy is vast and dangerous. And there are threats beyond your comprehension. And without Concord protection, your species would not last a century." Admiral Tanaka spoke for the first time, her voice soft but clear. "Protection from what exactly?" Salveth turned her 4 eyes toward the Admiral. "From yourselves primarily, because our assessment determined that your species is unstable and violent and prone to self-destruction. And you require guidance to overcome these deficiencies." She paused to let this sink in. "You have been evaluated, Admiral, and you have been found wanting. And this is not an insult but simply a fact. And the sooner you accept this fact, the easier your transition will be." Another silence. Longer this time, the humans were looking at each other, and something was passing between them. Some unspoken communication that Salveth's cultural algorithms could not interpret. Chen cleared his throat. "And if we decline your generous offer," Salveth made the Volante equivalent of a laugh, a wet bubbling sound from her respiratory membranes. "Decline is not a concept that applies to you, Secretary General, because you have 7 vessels capable of interstellar travel. And the Concord has 47 million, and your weapons are toys compared to ours. And your soldiers would fall like insects before our forces." She leaned forward. "This is not a negotiation. Because there is nothing to negotiate. Because you have nothing we want and nothing we need. And the only question is whether you will accept your place willingly or whether we will need to demonstrate why resistance is futile." Admiral Tanaka's expression did not change. "You seem very certain of your assessment." I am certain because the Concord has been right about every species for 12,000 years. And you are not special, Admiral, and you are not different. And you are exactly what our evaluation determined you to be. Chun smiled then, and it was not a pleasant smile. And Solveth felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt uncertain. We will need time to consider, Chun said, and to consult with our people, and to prepare for whatever comes next. Solveth recovered her composure. You have one of your cycles, and then you will give your answer. And there is only one answer that will be accepted. The meeting ended, and Solveth returned to her ship. And the Concord fleet departed Earth's orbit with their weapons powered down and their shields inactive. Because what did they have to fear from such a primitive species as the divine mandate accelerated toward hyperspace? Solveth reviewed the meeting in her mind, and she kept returning to that moment when the humans had looked at each other and to the smile on Chun's face at the end. There had been something in that smile that bothered her. Something she could not quite identify, and she tried to dismiss it as the meaningless expression of a primitive creature, facing its own insignificance. But late that night, as the ship traveled through hyperspace toward Nexus Prime, Solveth woke from her rest cycle with a sudden realization. The humans had not looked afraid. They had not looked defeated. They had looked like they were calculating, and for the first time in her very long career, Solveth wondered if perhaps the Concord had missed something important. But she pushed the thought away and went back to sleep. Because the Concord was never wrong, and the humans were weak. And there was nothing to worry about, nothing at all. The silence. 2 years passed, and Earth went quiet. The deadline came and went, and the humans sent no response to the Concord's ultimatum. And when Concord officials attempted to contact Earth's government, they received only automated messages saying that the relevant personnel were unavailable. At first, the High Assembly was outraged by this insult, and several admirals demanded immediate military action to teach the humans their place. But cooler heads prevailed. The humans were insignificant, after all, and the Concord had more important matters to address. And eventually the upstart species would realize that they had no choice but to submit. So the galaxy moved on, and humanity was largely forgotten. And the great powers of the Concord continued their ancient games of politics and commerce and subtle warfare. But some observers noticed things. A Lithori merchant captain named Seven Facets Gleaming reported unusual activity in the human system, with massive industrial operations in the asteroid belt that seemed far beyond the capacity of such a small population, and cargo ships traveling in patterns that made no commercial sense. A Mindweaver scout detected energy signatures near human space that matched no known technology. But when she reported this to her superiors, they dismissed it as instrument error, because the humans could not possibly have developed anything new in such a short time. A Krethian patrol vessel encountered a human ship near the border of Concord space, and when they demanded identification, the human vessel simply accelerated away at speeds that should have been impossible for their primitive drives. And by the time the Krethians could react, it was gone. These reports filtered up through the bureaucracy and were filed away and forgotten, because they did not match what everyone knew to be true about humanity. The humans were weak. The humans were primitive. The humans were nothing. But the strangest reports concerned human diplomats. In the 2 years since the ultimatum, humanity had sent ambassadors to dozens of species throughout Concord space, but not to the powerful species, not to the Krethians or the Mindweavers or the Lithori. Instead, they visited the Forgotten Ones. The Vethkai were a warrior species whose homeworld had been strip-mined by Concord Corporation centuries ago, and now they survived as mercenaries and laborers, their culture dying. Their people scattered across 100 worlds. A human ambassador came to their largest settlement and met with their elders in secret, and what they discussed was never recorded. The Remnori were refugees, the survivors of a war that had destroyed their civilization 500 years ago. A war the Concord had declined to prevent because it served their economic interests. And now the Remnori lived in camps and slums and dreamed of a home they would never see again. Human diplomats visited these camps and spoke with the Remnori leaders and shared meals with their families and listened to their stories of loss and betrayal. The Axiom Collective were synthetic beings, artificial intelligences housed in mechanical bodies, and the Concord had declared them non-persons, property rather than citizens, and they had no rights and no voice and no hope. Humans came to them as well, in secret, in hidden places where the Concord's surveillance did not reach, and they talked about ideas that had never been spoken aloud in Concord space. The Dralith were a gentle species who had been relocated from their ancestral worlds to make room for Krethian expansion, and millions of them had died in the relocation, and the survivors had never recovered. Human ambassadors found them and sat with them and asked them questions that no one had ever asked before. What happened to you? And how did it feel? And what do you want? And what would you do if you had the chance? These meetings were not reported to the Concord, because the species involved knew better than to draw attention to themselves, and the humans asked them to keep the conversations private. And they agreed, because something about the humans made them want to trusting the great archives of Nexus Prime. A junior analyst named Kethvorin the Younger noticed patterns in the data that troubled him, and he prepared a report suggesting that humanity might be more dangerous than the original assessment indicated. And he submitted this report to his superiors. It was rejected. "You are imagining threats where none exist," his supervisor told him, "because the humans are Class 7, and Class 7 species do not pose threats. And your report contradicts established doctrine. And I suggest you focus on more productive work." Kethvorin the Younger filed his report anyway, in a minor archive where it would never be read, and he returned to his other duties. And he tried to forget about the strange species from the Orion arm, but late at night, when he reviewed the data alone, he could not shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Meanwhile, on Earth, humanity worked. They worked in underground facilities that the Concord satellites could not see. And they worked in hollowed-out asteroids that looked like nothing more than mining operations. And they worked on ships that traveled only through routes the Concord did not monitor. They had intercepted every piece of Concord communication, and they had decoded every encryption. And they had learned everything there was to learn about the civilization that had declared them worthless. They learned about the weapons and the shields and the drives. And the tactics. They learned about the politics and the alliances. And the ancient grudges. They learned about the species who had been crushed and forgotten and left to suffer. And they built ships, unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, using principles that human scientists had developed in secret, hidden from the watching eyes above. Principles that the Concord's complacent researchers had never imagined because they had stopped innovating. Centuries ago, they built alliances with the forgotten and the broken and the abandoned. Not through threats or bribes, but through something the Concord had never understood: respect. They treated the Vethkai as warriors deserving of honor, and they treated the Remnori as survivors deserving of homes. And they treated the Axiom as people deserving of rights. And they treated the Dralith as victims deserving of justice, and in return, these species gave humanity something priceless. They gave them information and support. And hope and loyalty. They gave them the location of every Concord weakness. They gave them an army of allies who had been waiting 12,000 years for someone to treat them as equals. The humans had nothing to offer but an idea and a promise. The idea was simple: the Concord is not inevitable. The promise was simpler still: when the time comes, remember who came to you as friends. And so the galaxy slept, confident in its power, certain of its superiority, blind to the storm that was gathering in the darkness while humanity prepared for war. The Krethian subjugation fleet arrived at Earth on what the humans called a Tuesday 1200 warships emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, their weapons hot, their shields raised, their crews eager for the glory of conquest. And at their center was the dreadnought Inevitable Victory, a vessel so massive that it had its own gravity well, a mountain of metal and death that had destroyed entire civilizations. Admiral Rexton stood on the command bridge and looked upon the blue world through his compound eyes, and he felt nothing but contempt for the creatures that lived there. The humans had missed their deadline by 18 months, and they had ignored all subsequent communications, and they had committed the unforgivable sin of making the Concorde wait. And now they would learn why that was a mistake of Rex that had commanded genocides. And he had shattered species that had achieved interstellar travel while humans were still living in caves. And he had crushed rebellions and conquered empires, and never once had he failed. And this would be the easiest mission of his career. "Open a channel," he ordered, his voice like stones grinding together, "and let them see what death looks like." The view screen flickered to life, and a human face appeared, a woman with dark skin and gray hair cut close to her skull. And she wore a uniform that Rexton did not recognize. Black and silver with no insignia he could identify. Her eyes were steady, and her expression was calm. And she showed no fear. This annoyed Rexton. "This is Fleet Admiral Amara Okonkwo of United Earth Defense Force," the woman said, "and you have entered sovereign human space without authorization, and you will withdraw immediately." Rexton's mandibles clicked with amusement. "You have courage, human, even if you lack wisdom, and I respect courage. So I will give you a chance to surrender before we begin. And if you surrender now, I will ensure that your death is quick." Admiral Okonkwo did not respond to the offer. "I note that you have brought 1,200 vessels," she said. "And that is an impressive number, and I can see that you are proud of your fleet." "Admiral, the greatest fleet ever assembled for a subjugation mission," Rexton confirmed. "And there is nothing you can do to stop us. And there is nothing anyone can do. And this is the end of your species." "Human," Admiral Okonkwo smiled. "I count 1,207. Rexton's tactical officer made a sound like breaking glass, and the bridge fell silent, and every screen on the ship began flashing red with warnings that made no sense. "Admiral," the tactical officer stammered, "sensors are detecting massive signatures emerging from—" "That is not possible. They did not come through hyperspace. They are just appearing, Admiral." "Where did they come from?" Rexton turned to the main view screen and watched his certainty crumble into dust. "They came out of the darkness between worlds, 7 ships, each one larger than the Inevitable Victory. Their hulls black and angular and covered in weapons that the Krethian databases could not identify. Their drives burning with light that hurt to look at. Their very presence seeming to bend space around them. Human ships, impossible human ships, and behind them came more. Hundreds more, thousands more, ships of every size and configuration. Ships bearing insignias that Rexton recognized with growing horror. Vethkai raiders. Their hulls scarred from centuries of struggle. Remuneri carriers. Ancient vessels that should have been scrapped long ago, but had been rebuilt and upgraded with technology that looked human ships of the Axiom Collective. Synthetic vessels crewed by synthetic beings who owed no loyalty to the Concorde ships of the Dralith, the gentle species who had supposedly forgotten how to fight ships, of a dozen other species that the Concorde had dismissed and forgotten and left to die. And at the head of this armada, the 7 great vessels of the human fleet, each one bearing a name written in letters that glowed against the black hole. Defiance, and remembrance, and justice, and fury, and hope, and unity. And at their center, the largest ship of all, the vessel that served as Admiral Okonkwo's flagship, humanity's answer. You spent 12,000 years teaching the galaxy to fear you, Admiral Okonkwo said, a voice cutting through the chaos on Rexton's bridge. And you were very successful. And every species learned that lesson well. She paused. But you never considered that you were also teaching them to hate. Rexton found his voice. You cannot win. And even with your new ships, you are outnumbered. And even with your allies, you cannot match Concord technology. And this changes nothing. You are correct that we are outnumbered. Admiral Okonkwo agreed. And you are correct that until recently we could not match Concord technology. She leaned forward. But you made a mistake when you assessed us, Admiral, and the mistake was assuming that we would stay primitive. And the mistake was assuming that we would accept our place. And the mistake was giving us time. The human flagship began to glow with power. 2 years is nothing to you, because your species lives for thousands of years. And 2 years is barely enough time to notice. And so you did not notice what we were doing. And what were you doing? Rexton demanded. Learning, Admiral Okonkwo replied. And building and making friends and preparing for this moment. The first shot came from humanity's answer. A beam of light that crossed the distance between the fleets in less than a second. And it struck the inevitable victory shields. And the shields held for perhaps a heartbeat before they collapsed. And then the beam continued through the hull of the dreadnought, as if it were made of paper. Rexton had time to feel surprise before the ship exploded around him. The Battle of Earth lasted 7 minutes. Human weapons cut through Krethian armor like it was not there. And Vethkai raiders swarmed the enemy flanks with tactics they had been perfecting for centuries. And Axiom vessels hacked into Concord systems and turned their own ships against each other. When it was over, 1,200 Krethian warships had been reduced to debris, and not a single human vessel had been destroyed. And the Allied fleet stood triumphant above the blue world. Admiral Okonkwo looked at the wreckage of the subjugation fleet and felt no joy. This was only the beginning. Set course for Nexus Prime, she ordered, and inform the fleet that we move in 1 hour. She turned to her communications officer and sent a message to the High Assembly. And tell them we are coming. And tell them they have one choice. The officer nodded. What choice should I tell them they have? Admiral Okonkwo smiled, but there was no humor in it. They can surrender. Or they can share the fate of Admiral Rexton. And either way, the Concord ends today. The fleet moved into formation. And one by one, the ships engaged their drives. And they headed toward the heart of the empire that had called humanity weak, and the galaxy trembled. The reckoning the High Assembly had not known fear in 6,000 years. Last time they had felt anything like it was during the Lithori Rebellion, when the Silicon beings had risen against their Concord masters and fought for their freedom. And the war had lasted a century and cost billions of lives before the Lithori were finally defeated and brought back into the fold. But that had been different, because the Lithori were a powerful species, ancient and wise and dangerous. And their rebellion had been expected. No one had expected this. The human fleet did not stop after the Battle of Earth. It carved a path through Concord space like a blade through flesh. And every system it passed through saw the same thing. Human ships accompanied by vessels of a dozen other species, all flying together under a single command, all fighting with a unity that should have been impossible. They struck military installations and reduced them to rubble. They destroyed slave processing centers where developing species were broken and trained for labor. They liberated orbital platforms where billions of beings had lived in chains for generations, and everywhere they went, they broadcast the same message. The Concord is finished, and a new order is coming. And choose your side carefully. Some Concord forces fought back, and they were destroyed. Some Concord forces surrendered, and they were disarmed and sent home. Some Concord forces defected. Soldiers and officers who had never believed in the empire they served, who had waited their whole lives for someone to give them permission to do what they knew was right. The human fleet grew larger with every system it passed through, and now it sat in orbit above Nexus Prime, the capital of the Galactic Concord, the heart of an empire that had ruled for 12,000 years. And the High Assembly met in their great chamber of living crystal and tried to understand how everything had gone so wrong. High Emissary Solveth stood before the gathered representatives, and for the first time in her long career, she had nothing to say. The holographic display showed the human fleet, thousands of ships of every size and design, enough firepower to crack the planet below. And at the center of it all was humanity's answer, the flagship from which Admiral Okonkwo commanded. They are requesting permission to send a delegation, a communications officer reported. His voice barely above a whisper. The assembly chamber erupted in argument, with some representatives demanding immediate surrender and others calling for a final desperate attack, and still others suggesting negotiation or escape, or 100 other options that everyone knew were useless in the end. They had no choice. The human delegation was allowed to land. Admiral Okonkwo entered the assembly chamber flanked by guards from a dozen species. Vethkai warriors in their ceremonial armor, Axiom units with weapons built into their bodies, Remnori soldiers who had trained for this moment their entire lives. And at the center of them all, the human admiral, small and soft and fragile-looking, walking with a confidence that made every representative in the chamber shift uncomfortably. She stopped in the center of the floor and looked around at the gathered species. And when she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the vast space. "You declared us weak," she said. "And you were right." The chamber fell silent, individually. "We are fragile, and our bodies break easily. And we die young, and we have none of the natural gifts that other species possess. And by every measure you use to evaluate us, we should be insignificant." She paused. "But you measured the wrong things." She began to walk slowly around the chamber, and her guards moved with her, and her voice never wavered. "You saw that we fought among ourselves, and you thought this made us weak, but you did not understand that we were learning, that every war taught us something new, that we were sharpening ourselves against each other until we became something dangerous." She stopped before a group of Krethian representatives, and they flinched back from her gaze. "You saw that we live short lives, and you thought this made us desperate and foolish. But you did not understand that it made us efficient, that we learned to accomplish in decades what other species take centuries to achieve, that we could not afford to waste time." She moved on, passing the Mind-Weavers, the Lithori, the dozens of species that had built their power on the backs of others. "You saw that we had no natural weapons, and you thought this made us helpless, but you did not understand that it made us inventive, that we learned to build weapons because we had none, that we learned to think our way out of problems because we could not fight our way out." She returned to the center of the chamber and turned to face the High Assembly's leadership. "But your greatest mistake was not in how you measured us, and your greatest mistake was in how you treated the others." She gestured, and her all eyes stepped forward. Representatives of the Vethkai and the Remnori and the Axiom and the Dralith, and all the other species who had joined the human cause. "You crushed them," Admiral Okonkwo said. "And you used them and you threw them away when they were no longer useful. And you thought that made them nothing." She shook her head. "It made them angry, and it made them patient, and it made them ready for someone to show them that they did not have to accept their fate." Solveth found her voice at last. "What do you want?" she asked. And her words came out as barely more than a whisper. Admiral Okonkwo turned to face her. "The Concord is dissolved, and what rises in its place will be decided by all species, not just those you deemed worthy. And you will answer for your crimes. You mean to destroy us then? No, the Admiral said. And there was something in her voice that might have been pity, because we are not you. And we will not commit genocide, and we will not enslave. And we will not do to you what you did to others. She looked around the chamber one final time. But there will be justice. And there will be change, and you will learn what it means to be equal rather than superior. She turned to leave, then paused. One more thing, and this is important. And I want you to remember it. She looked back over her shoulder. You watched us for 3 years before first contact. And you saw us fighting each other with primitive weapons. And you saw our violence and our cruelty and our capacity for self-destruction. And you thought it made us weak. Her smile was sharp. You were watching us practice. The High Assembly surrendered that day, and the Galactic Concord officially ceased to exist. And in its place, a new organization began to take shape, built on principles that had never been tried on a galactic scale: equality and justice and respect for all species, regardless of power or age or capabilities. The Galactic Commonwealth held its founding assembly 3 years later, and representatives of over 1,000 species gathered to sign the charter. A document written in every known language that began with a simple statement: no species is insignificant, and no voice is unheard, and no world stands alone. Earth's representatives signed last. Not out of pride, but out of principle, because this was not humanity's empire. And they did not want it to be. Admiral Okonkwo was there for the signing, though she had retired from active service and now served as an advisor to the Commonwealth Council. And when the ceremony was over, she stood at a window looking out at the stars. A young Vethkai officer approached her, one of the warriors who had fought beside the humans in the war. "Admiral," he said, "may I ask you something?" She nodded. "How did you do it? And how did you build all of that in just 2 years? And how did you hide it from the Concord?" Okonkwo smiled. "That is a question many have asked, and I always give the same answer, which is, some secrets are worth keeping." The young officer looked puzzled, and Okonkwo laughed softly. "The galaxy is vast," she explained, "and there are dangers out there that we have not yet met. And it would be foolish to reveal everything we have learned and everything we can do." She looked out at the stars. "Humanity believes in being prepared." The young officer nodded slowly and left her alone with her thoughts and Admiral Amara. Okonkwo stood at the window and watched the ships of 100 species passing by, all flying together, all working toward a future that no one had thought possible just a few years ago. She thought about the day the Concord had declared humanity weak, and she thought about everything that had happened since, and she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Then she returned to work, because there was always more to do. The universe was vast and full of wonders and dangers, and humanity would be ready for all of it, because that was what humans did. They remembered, and they learned, and they prepared. And when the time came, they acted, and they never ever gave up.